In 1911, a Norwegian explorer named Roald Amundsen walked into one of the most hostile environments on Earth with a plan so simple it almost sounded insulting. His goal was the South Pole, a place designed to erase human error with permanent consequences. Temperatures could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Winds could turn direction into hallucination. A small mistake was not a lesson. It was disappearance. At the same time, another expedition led by Robert Falcon Scott was racing toward the exact same destination. Same dream, same prestige, same frozen continent. But the two men operated under radically different philosophies. Scott pushed hard when conditions were favorable, maximizing effort, covering as much distance as possible, squeezing every ounce from good days. The logic sounds familiar. If conditions are ideal, you must capitalize fully. Amundsen did something that looked irrational. He imposed a fixed daily system. Whether conditions were good or terrible, his team traveled approximately the same manageable distance. Not maximum output, not heroic effort, controlled repetition. On days when the weather was generous, he stopped early anyway. While others would have seen wasted opportunity, he saw preserved energy. Predictability, survival. To an outside observer, this looked absurd. Why would anyone intentionally hold back while racing history itself? But extreme environments reveal truths ordinary life hides. They expose which beliefs collapse under pressure. Most people think failure comes from not pushing hard enough. That if you really wanted something, you would use every good day like your life depended on it. Sometimes that belief is exactly what kills the mission. And sometimes the person who wins is not the one who can go hardest, but the one who understands a quieter law. Survival is often built on restraint. This logic does not stay in Antarctica. It follows people home. You see it in someone who misses one workout and unconsciously converts one absence into a 7-day collapse. In the writer who cannot produce 10 perfect pages, so produces nothing. In the person who eats one unplanned meal and silently decides the entire week is ruined. The behavior looks different on the surface, but underneath it runs on the same private contract. If I cannot do this properly, it does not count. A dangerous sentence. Not because it sounds dramatic, but because it sounds reasonable. It disguises self-destruction as standards. People rarely say, I am sabotaging myself. They say, I'll restart when I can do it correctly. Tomorrow, Monday, next month. After I have more energy, more clarity, better conditions. Life gets postponed in the name of optimization. And so an invisible threshold is created. Action only qualifies if it arrives under perfect emotional weather. But human existence is mostly bad weather. Fatigue, friction, distraction, low motivation, boredom, uncertainty, emotional residue from problems that have nothing to do with the task itself. This means that if your system only works on ideal days, then you do not actually have a system. You have a fantasy contract with reality. That is the trap. Confusing intensity with durability. Because intensity feels powerful. Creates the illusion of seriousness. It flatters the ego. It lets you imagine that your future success will arrive through one magnificent burst of effort. But lives are rarely shaped by dramatic peaks. They are shaped in the quiet negotiations you have with yourself on ordinary, forgettable days no one will ever witness. That is where trajectories are built or destroyed. There is a brutal misunderstanding at the center of modern ambition. People assume discipline is the ability to perform at a high level repeatedly. It is not. That definition sounds noble, but it quietly excludes the majority of human experience. It assumes stable emotions, stable energy, stable focus, stable environments. A machine could meet that standard. A human cannot. Real discipline is far less glamorous. It is the ability to remain operational when conditions are psychologically unattractive. Not when you feel inspired. Not when your schedule is clean. Not when your confidence is inflated by momentum. When you are irritated, sleep-deprived, distracted, discouraged, mentally fragmented. That is where systems are tested. Most people are not defeated by difficulty itself. They are defeated by their interpretation of reduced capacity. The moment their output drops below their internal ideal, they emotionally categorize the day as compromised. And once a day is psychologically labeled as bad, effort feels meaningless. This is a catastrophic cognitive error, because reality does not care whether your contribution today was impressive. Reality compounds continuity. A small action repeated under friction carries a different psychological weight than a large action performed once under perfect conditions. One builds identity, the other builds fantasy. There is a hidden architecture behind people who appear impossibly consistent. Not superhuman willpower, not endless motivation. Something much less cinematic and far more practical. A structure built specifically for failure states. A way of behaving that allows progress to survive ugly days. And once you see it, you begin to notice how many personal collapses were never caused by lack of ambition. Only by a rule you never consciously agreed to, but obeyed anyway. There is an uncomfortable possibility you may have spent years misunderstanding what progress actually requires. Not because you lack intelligence, not because you lack desire, but because somewhere along the way, you inherited a belief so culturally admired that almost nobody questions it. That valuable effort must look impressive. That if the work is small, reduced, inelegant, partial, or embarrassingly easy, it is beneath your standards. So your standards become a beautiful prison. You would rather produce nothing than produce something that does not match your self-image. And this creates a strange contradiction. You claim to care deeply about growth, but your behavior is governed by aesthetic preferences about how growth should feel. You are not optimizing for progress. You are optimizing for emotional dignity, for the comfort of saying, when I act properly. But life does not negotiate with your preferred emotional narrative. It continues accumulating consequences while you wait for a version of yourself who feels more ready. So the real question is not whether you are capable of greatness. That question is easy, flattering, and mostly irrelevant. The real question is harsher. Can you tolerate becoming the kind of person who continues moving when the movement is unimpressive? Can your ego survive reduced effort without translating it into personal failure? Or have you unconsciously built a life where your standards are so rigid that they produce the very inconsistency they were supposed to eliminate? What if the reason you keep stopping is not lack of discipline, but your inability to respect progress when it arrives in an unglamorous form? A single mistake should be psychologically small. A cookie is not a collapse. One missed workout is not physical decline. One delayed task is not a ruined career. Rationally, this is obvious. And yet, human behavior repeatedly violates this logic. In the 1980s, psychologists C. Peter Herman and Janet Polivy began documenting a pattern that was as ordinary as it was disturbing. Their research focused on restrained eaters, people actively attempting to control food intake through dieting, rules, and self-monitoring. The expectation seemed simple. People with stronger dietary restraint should recover better after minor deviations. The opposite happened. In one variation of what became known as the what the hell effect, participants were divided into groups. Some consumed a preload, typically a milkshake or calorie-dense food, before being given access to ice cream under the guise of a taste test. A rational system predicts compensation. If you have already consumed extra calories, you should logically eat less afterward. Restrained eaters often did the reverse. After the preload, many consumed more ice cream than participants who had eaten nothing beforehand. Not slightly more, meaningfully more. A small violation did not trigger correction. It triggered abandonment. The internal logic was brutal and familiar. I already broke the rule, so the rule no longer matters. What should have been a minor deviation became permission for escalation. This is not about food. Food was simply the laboratory doorway into something much larger. A single crack in self-control was enough to transform controlled behavior into impulsive excess. Not because the person was weak, but because once purity was lost, the mind reclassified the entire effort as contaminated. And contamination, once psychologically accepted, has a strange power. It makes destruction feel oddly rational. This pattern appears irrational only from the outside. Inside the mind, something else is happening. The problem is not the cookie, the missed habit, or the imperfect action itself. The real damage occurs in the meaning assigned to the event. A person with flexible thinking interprets deviation as information. A person trapped in rigid standards interprets deviation as identity failure. That distinction changes everything. When the restrained eater consumes the milkshake, the physical calories are not what trigger the binge. The calories are measurable, finite, limited. The psychological interpretation is infinite. The mind silently performs a catastrophic translation. Not, I consumed more than planned, but I failed. And once behavior becomes moralized, the system destabilizes. Because now the goal is no longer regulation. It is purity. Purity is fragile, can survive effort, cannot survive contamination. This is why all-or-nothing systems feel powerful in the beginning. Their rules are clear. Their boundaries are clean. Their identity rewards are immediate. You are either on track or off track, disciplined or undisciplined, good or bad. But reality does not respect binary systems. Human behavior is noisy. Sleep changes. Emotions fluctuate. Stress intrudes. Attention fragments. Sooner or later, deviation is guaranteed. And when your entire structure is built on perfection, imperfection does not create adaptation. It creates collapse. This is why people can maintain impossible standards for days, weeks, even months, and still repeatedly self-destruct. Not because they lacked commitment, but because they built a system with no psychological architecture for damage. The moment reality touched the system shattered. Not gradually, instantly. The cruelty of this mechanism is that it disguises itself as discipline. From the outside, rigid standards can look admirable. Strict diet plans, aggressive productivity schedules, daily quotas, zero-tolerance rules. Feels serious, feels committed. It feels like the architecture of high performance. But hidden inside these systems is a dangerous condition. They are only stable while untouched. They perform beautifully in theory. They fail in contact with ordinary life. One unexpected dinner invitation, one night of poor sleep, one emotional argument, one day of reduced energy. That is all it takes. Because rigid systems do not bend. They snap. This is what Herman and Paul Ivy exposed with brutal clarity. The issue was never lack of knowledge. Dieters understood calories. They understood goals. They understood desired behavior. Information was not missing. What was missing was a mechanism for surviving imperfection without psychological escalation. Without that mechanism, a tiny deviation mutates into a narrative. And narratives are more dangerous than behaviors. Behaviors are isolated. Narratives spread. A missed action becomes evidence. Evidence becomes identity. Identity becomes prophecy. Soon the person is no longer reacting to one mistake. They are reacting to what the mistake appears to mean. This is why people often suffer more from symbolic failure than from actual consequences. The consequences may be trivial. The symbolism is devastating, because the mind is rarely asking, what happened? It is asking something far more destabilizing. What does this say about me? Once this pattern is seen, it becomes impossible not to recognize it everywhere. Not just in dieting. In relationships abandoned after one difficult conversation. In creative projects discarded after one weak attempt. In routines erased by a single interruption. A mind governed by all-or-nothing logic does not evaluate progress cumulatively. It evaluates purity. And purity creates a brutal hidden rule. If the streak is broken, the meaning is broken. So people do something extraordinary. They punish themselves for imperfection by increasing the scale of imperfection. One deviation becomes 5. 5 becomes 10. Not because escalation is pleasurable. Because psychologically, once the identity wound is opened, continuation feels pointless. This is the true violence of perfectionism. It does not merely ask for excellence. It makes partial success emotionally illegible. Anything less than ideal is translated into emotional debris. This means the person is not just fighting behavior. They are fighting interpretation. and interpretation can overpower reason with terrifying efficiency. A rational observer sees one minor error. The individual experiences contamination. A tiny event acquires totalizing meaning. This is why so many collapses begin with something laughably small. Not because the event was large, but because the mind transforms scale. And once scale is psychologically distorted, consequences multiply far beyond the original act. But what makes this mechanism truly dangerous is not how it begins. It is how ordinary it feels while it is happening. And what hides beneath that ordinariness is far darker than a broken rule. It is an entire system of self-worth waiting for the slightest crack to reveal itself. If one small mistake can destroy momentum, then the obvious question becomes uncomfortable. What kind of action is small enough to survive imperfection? For decades, the dominant mythology around behavior change was built on intensity. Bigger goals, more discipline, stronger motivation, radical commitment. The assumption was seductive. Transformation begins with ambition. B.J. Fogg, founder of the Stanford Behavior Design Lab, challenged that assumption by attacking something people rarely question: the starting size of a habit. His observation was simple and almost offensive in its modesty. People consistently overestimate what they can sustain emotionally and underestimate what they can automate behaviorally. So instead of asking people to aim high, Fogg asked them to aim absurdly low. Not 30 minutes of exercise, 2 push-ups, not a complete oral hygiene overhaul, floss 1 tooth, not daily meditation mastery, 1 deep breath. The proposal sounded ridiculous, almost insulting. To an ambitious mind, these behaviors feel too small to deserve respect. They appear meaningless, childish, beneath the dignity of serious change. That reaction was exactly the point. Because when a behavior is reduced below the threshold of internal resistance, something unusual happens. Negotiation disappears. The mind no longer needs to debate effort, energy, mood, or timing. The action becomes too small to justify avoidance. This was not designed to maximize immediate results. It was designed to solve a more primitive problem: initiation. Because most people do not fail at the level of execution. They fail at the moment before action begins. In the microscopic gap where intention meets friction. That is where grand plans quietly die. Not in catastrophe, in hesitation. This reveals a truth that most ambitious people find deeply irritating. The size of an action matters less than its repeatability. Not because outcomes are irrelevant, but because behavior is not built from isolated effort. It is built from pattern memory. Every repeated action leaves behind a psychological residue, a trace, a vote, evidence that a behavior belongs to you. This is what Fogg understood with unusual clarity. A habit is not born when a person proves intensity. A habit is born when a behavior becomes familiar enough to feel normal. This is a completely different mechanism. Intensity creates emotional drama. Repetition creates neurological economy. The brain is constantly trying to conserve energy. Every action that becomes predictable becomes cheaper. Less resistance, less deliberation, less emotional cost. This means that an action performed consistently at microscopic scale can quietly become more behaviorally stable than a dramatic action performed sporadically. To an outside observer, this seems absurd. How could 2 push-ups matter? They matter because the physical movement is not the main event. The repetition is. Each completion reduces the psychological distance between identity and behavior. Not, I want to become someone who exercises, but I am already a person who does not skip. This distinction is subtle and psychologically enormous. People often obsess over visible progress while ignoring invisible stabilization. But visible progress is fragile if the behavior underneath remains unstable. A person who relies on motivation is renting action. A person who builds repeatability is purchasing architecture. And architecture is what survives emotional weather. Not because it is glamorous, because it is structurally boring, which is precisely why it works. Fogg's method included another detail that appears almost embarrassingly simple: celebration. After completing the tiny habit, The individual was instructed to create a positive emotional response immediately. A small internal celebration, a smile, a silent good, a brief physical gesture. This was not motivational theater. It was behavioral engineering, because habits are not only encoded through repetition. They are reinforced through emotion. The brain remembers what feels rewarding, not what sounds logical. This creates a brutal disconnect in how people approach self-improvement. They assume punishment creates discipline, guilt, shame, self-criticism, harsh internal correction. But these emotional states increase behavioral friction. They make the behavior psychologically expensive. Tiny habits inverted the formula. Lower the behavioral demand. Increase the probability of success. Pair completion with immediate emotional reward. The system sounds almost laughably gentle, which is exactly why many high-achieving personalities initially reject it. It does not feel intense enough to be respectable. But respectability is irrelevant. The nervous system does not care about your aesthetic preferences for suffering. It responds to reinforcement patterns. And reinforcement patterns are often embarrassingly unspectacular. A behavior repeated in a low-friction, emotionally positive context begins to stabilize with remarkable efficiency. No drama.
No heroic struggle.
No identity crisis. Just repetition quietly changing default behavior beneath conscious awareness. This is deeply threatening to a culture addicted to transformation narratives built on pain. Because it suggests something uncomfortable. You may not need a more powerful version of yourself. Only a less resistant starting point. This is where the logic becomes psychologically disruptive. Most people are not failing because their goals are too small. They are failing because their entry point is too large. They keep trying to install behaviors at a scale their current identity cannot metabolize. The ambition is not the problem. The loading dose is. A behavior too large activates friction before repetition can stabilize. And once friction wins repeatedly, the mind learns something dangerous. Avoidance. Not as laziness, as protection. The behavior becomes associated with internal cost, effort, resistance, threat to self-image. So each failed restart strengthens the emotional barrier around beginning, until eventually the person starts fearing the very process they claim to want. This is why microscopic beginnings are not trivial. They are strategic. They allow the mind to experience continuity before resistance has time to organize opposition. A tiny action slips beneath the radar of self-sabotage, almost unnoticed. But beneath that smallness, something structurally significant is taking place. A behavior is no longer theoretical. It is alive. And once alive, even in fragile form, it can be repeated, expanded, integrated. But what makes this truly unsettling is not how small the beginning can be. It is realizing how often people have mistaken dramatic effort for progress, while quietly training themselves to associate change with exhaustion. And once change becomes emotionally expensive, the real obstacle is no longer action itself. It is the mind's learned instinct to protect you from becoming the person you say you want to be. Once a behavior is alive, a new threat immediately appears. Not difficulty, interruption, because starting is psychologically expensive, but restarting is often worse. A person can survive one imperfect day. What destroys systems is what happens after. The gap, the empty space where one missed action quietly becomes two. Then something no longer measurable as absence, but as disconnection. This is where an unexpectedly simple idea gained unusual power. Jerry Seinfeld became associated with a productivity method so visually primitive it almost seems beneath analysis. A wall calendar, a red marker, a repeated behavior. The method, popularized through an anecdote often called, "Don't break the chain," was straightforward. Each day the target behavior was completed. A large red X was marked on the calendar. One day connected to the next. Then another. Then another. Soon, isolated actions transformed into a visible chain. The task itself mattered less than preserving continuity. Not brilliance, not quality, not intensity, presence. This was the shift. The calendar externalized time. Behavior stopped existing as vague intention floating inside memory and became visible structure. A streak. Pattern with physical form. This changes the psychological experience dramatically. A single action no longer feels isolated. It is connected to a growing sequence the mind becomes reluctant to damage. Humans are highly sensitive to visible progress. Not because progress is objectively meaningful at every stage, but because visible continuity creates emotional investment. You are no longer simply writing, training, practicing, or studying. You are protecting something, and protection activates a different psychology than ambition. Ambition chases future rewards. Protection defends what already exists. That subtle distinction changes compliance with shocking efficiency. The genius of this method is not motivational. It is architectural. People often assume consistency is maintained through emotional intensity. But emotions are unstable. Enthusiasm decays. Confidence fluctuates. Meaning changes from day to day. Systems built on emotional fuel are structurally exposed. The chain method shifts the center of gravity. Instead of asking, "Do I feel like doing meaningful work today?" the mind begins asking a simpler, narrower question. Do I want to break the chain? This is psychologically powerful because it reduces decision complexity. The behavior may still require effort, but the decision framework becomes binary and visually anchored. Continue or interrupt. That reduction matters. Decision fatigue is often underestimated. The more variables attached to action, quality, duration, intensity, emotional readiness, the more opportunities exist for internal negotiation. And negotiation is where avoidance breeds. A streak compresses complexity into a cleaner contract. Show up, mark the day, preserve continuity. This does something psychologically elegant. It lowers the cognitive load of identity maintenance. You no longer need to reinvent commitment every morning. The system remembers for you. The red marks become evidence, not of greatness, of recurrence. This distinction is profound, because most people are secretly addicted to evaluating themselves based on exceptional days. But exceptional days are statistically unstable. A streak rewards something much less glamorous and far more durable. Reliability, the ability to remain behaviorally present regardless of whether the day feels meaningful.
No απλώς. No transformation narrative.
Just another mark, and another, until repetition itself begins to feel more emotionally satisfying than interruption. Something even more interesting happens as the chain grows. The individual begins relating differently to time. Without visible continuity, days feel psychologically isolated. Monday is disconnected from Tuesday, Tuesday from Wednesday. Each day becomes a separate moral referendum. Did I perform well? Did I fail? Was today useful? This creates chronic volatility. Identity is constantly renegotiated. But a streak introduces narrative cohesion. Today is no longer an isolated event. It is part of an ongoing sequence, a link. This reduces the emotional significance of any single day. A mediocre session does not feel catastrophic when embedded inside continuity. This meaning shrinks. This is crucial, because much of behavioral collapse comes from overweighting individual moments. One bad day feels decisive. One low-energy effort feels symbolic. But inside a chain, a day is contextualized. Not judged in isolation. Judgment softens. Continuation becomes easier. This is why daily excellence is often overrated. Excellence is emotionally seductive but operationally fragile. Creates pressure. Pressure increases perfectionistic standards. And perfectionistic standards destabilize repeatability. Continuity operates differently. It does not ask each day to be impressive. Only connected. That single shift can alter an entire behavioral life. The person stops chasing perfect outputs and begins valuing unbroken presence. This sounds almost disappointingly modest, which is precisely why many people overlook its power. They want transformation to feel cinematic. But much of durable change is visually boring. A mark on a calendar, a line extending through time, a pattern that says one quiet thing: I returned. This is the deeper psychological inversion hidden beneath the method. The chain is not merely tracking behavior. It is manufacturing attachment. Over time, the visible streak accumulates symbolic value disproportionate to the action itself. A 5-minute effort may be trivial, but preserving 40 consecutive days is not psychologically trivial. The mind begins protecting the artifact, and artifacts carry emotional gravity. This changes the emotional economy of action. The reward is no longer delayed or abstract. It is immediate, visible, concrete. Each completed day strengthens both the chain and the relationship to it. This is why interruption becomes psychologically expensive. Not because missing one day destroys objective progress, but because it fractures a visible narrative of continuity. Humans are narrative creatures. We organize identity through patterns we can recognize. A streak becomes a story about reliability, about return, about someone who keeps coming back. This is more powerful than isolated achievement, because isolated achievement can be accidental. Recurrence feels intentional, and intention is what people use to construct self-trust. But this reveals something far less comfortable. Many people do not actually struggle with effort. They struggle with staying emotionally connected to their own continuity long enough for identity to solidify. The problem is rarely a lack of capacity. It is the quiet inability to tolerate the monotony required to become predictable to yourself. And what begins to surface when novelty disappears can be far more destabilizing than failure itself. What appears to be procrastination is often something more specific. Not resistance to effort, resistance to initiation. Many people can work for hours once engaged, yet spend entire days circling the perimeter of beginning, organizing, preparing, thinking, optimizing the conditions under which action will eventually occur, but not starting. This strange psychological friction fascinated a Soviet psychologist named Bluma Zygarnik in the 1920s. According to the account that inspired her research, Zygarnik noticed something curious while sitting in a restaurant in Vienna. Waiters appeared to remember unpaid orders with unusual precision. Tables still in process remained cognitively alive. But once payment was completed and the interaction closed, details were forgotten quickly. This observation became the seed of what would later be called the Zygarnik effect. In her formal experiments, participants were asked to perform a series of simple tasks: puzzles, crafts, problem-solving activities, manual exercises. Some tasks were allowed to reach completion. Others were intentionally interrupted before participants could finish. Later, participants were asked what they remembered. The pattern was striking. Interrupted tasks were remembered significantly better than completed ones. Something unfinished remained mentally active. A completed action closes a loop. An incomplete one leaves tension. This is not metaphorical. The mind appears to resist unresolved cognitive states. It holds open loops in working awareness, creating a subtle psychological pull toward closure. This changes the meaning of starting entirely. Beginning is not only the first unit of progress. It is the creation of tension. A task that does not exist exerts no force. A task begun but unfinished becomes psychologically magnetic. The mind dislikes open loops more than it dislikes effort. This explains a familiar but often misunderstood phenomenon. The hardest part of many tasks is not continuation. It is the moment before the first move, before writing the first sentence, before opening the file, before tying the shoes, before sending the first message, before making contact with the activity. Prior to initiation, the task exists only as abstraction, an undefined cognitive mass, large enough to intimidate, flexible enough to be endlessly postponed. But the moment action begins, the psychological geometry changes. Abstraction becomes object. The vague becomes concrete. And once concrete, the mind can no longer fully ignore it. This is why starting often produces disproportionate momentum. Not because motivation suddenly appears, but because unfinished action creates mental persistence. A low-grade tension enters awareness. The brain continues tracking the incomplete sequence. This is deeply inconvenient, which is exactly why it can be useful. People often wait for desire before beginning, but desire is unreliable. Initiation can create its own internal propulsion. A tiny action is often enough, not because the action itself is impressive, because it changes the task's ontological status. It is no longer hypothetical. It is active, and active things occupy mental territory. This is psychologically disruptive to avoidance. Avoidance thrives on distance. A task unopened can be romanticized, feared, idealized, or ignored. A task touched becomes real, and reality is harder to indefinitely postpone. The first movement is small in physical terms, but cognitively it changes the entire field. This is where many self-improvement systems fail silently. They overvalue scale. They undervalue activation. A person tells themselves they need a fully optimized session to make progress meaningful. 2 uninterrupted hours, perfect concentration, ideal conditions, a large enough block of time to justify beginning. But this logic accidentally strengthens paralysis, because the higher the entry requirement, the more psychologically expensive initiation becomes. The task is forced to clear an increasingly dramatic threshold before action is allowed. Often, it never does. Zeigarnik's findings suggest something less intuitive. Progress is not always initiated by solving the whole problem. Sometimes it is initiated by creating just enough incompletion to make disengagement mentally costly. Partial outline, a half-written sentence, 1 open browser tab, a notebook left open with 1 unfinished equation. These are not insignificant gestures. They are cognitive anchors, small openings through which tension can enter. Once entered, the mind begins carrying the unfinished structure with it, across rooms, across hours, sometimes across days. This is why seemingly trivial starts can outperform grand intentions. Grand intentions remain conceptual. Partial engagement creates residue, and residue alters attention. The task begins appearing in mental background processing. Not loudly, quietly, persistent enough to create return pressure. The mind begins pulling itself back toward closure. Not because of discipline, because unresolved systems are psychologically noisy, and noise is difficult to ignore indefinitely. There is an irony hidden inside this mechanism. People often avoid starting because they fear commitment. They imagine that beginning creates obligation, pressure, responsibility, exposure to possible failure. And they are correct. That is exactly what starting does. But what remains hidden is that avoidance does not eliminate tension. It merely changes its form. Instead of the productive tension of incompletion, a person inherits the heavier tension of chronic avoidance. A vague psychic weight, unopened loops, unacted intentions, accumulated cognitive debt. This is more corrosive than most people realize. Not because unfinished tasks are dangerous on their own, but because repeated avoidance trains the mind to normalize internal fragmentation. A growing archive of things not entered, not touched, not initiated. Over time, this alters self-perception. The person begins experiencing themselves as someone who circulates around action without penetrating it. Close enough to imagine progress, never close enough to generate momentum. This is why the first movement matters so disproportionately. Not because it guarantees completion, but because it ruptures psychological inertia. It changes your relationship with the task from observer to participant. A tiny beginning is enough to contaminate passivity. And once passivity is contaminated, stillness becomes less comfortable. But what most people never suspect is that initiation is only the first disturbance. Something more unsettling happens after the mind has been successfully activated. Something that begins not with action, but with what the brain does when movement can no longer be mentally ignored. Once movement begins, a new illusion quickly emerges. People assume the greatest obstacle to consistent behavior is lack of motivation. But motivation is often blamed for failures it did not create. Many behaviors collapse long before motivation becomes relevant. They die in contact with friction, tiny inconveniences, small delays, Minor logistical barriers so unremarkable they are almost invisible. A form to complete, an extra click, shoes stored in another room, a longer route, an object not immediately accessible. Nothing dramatic, and yet these microscopic barriers quietly determine astonishing amounts of human behavior. Researchers Ayelet Nizi and Suzanne Shu explored this uncomfortable truth through studies examining commitment, follow-through, and the effect of convenience barriers on action. Their findings pointed toward something deeply unromantic. People do not consistently act based on stated intention alone. They are profoundly sensitive to activation energy, the behavioral cost required to begin, even when motivation exists, even when goals are personally meaningful, even when individuals explicitly want the outcome. A small increase in effort can dramatically reduce compliance. A small reduction can dramatically increase it. This is psychologically disruptive because it threatens a flattering explanation. People prefer to believe failure reflects emotional depth, not architecture, not logistics, not convenience. It is easier to say, "I was not disciplined enough." Harder to admit that a behavior collapsed because the environment quietly taxed initiation beyond a tolerable threshold. This sounds almost embarrassingly trivial, which is precisely why it is so powerful. Human behavior is often less heroic than personal narratives suggest, not governed by grand declarations, but by the friction profile of the immediate environment. A single unnecessary step can become the birthplace of non-action. This is not a story about laziness. It is a story about thresholds. Every action has an entry cost. Some costs are obvious: time, money, physical exertion. Others are almost imperceptible: attention switching, decision load, environmental preparation, task setup. These smaller costs are often dismissed because they do not feel morally significant. But behavior does not care whether a barrier feels meaningful, only whether it exists. Shu and Nizi's research repeatedly demonstrated that small structural changes can produce disproportionate shifts in follow-through. Not because people suddenly became more virtuous, because the path of action became behaviorally smoother. This is difficult for many people to emotionally accept. They want behavior change to validate identity, to prove willpower, strength, character. But systems optimized around friction reduction are indifferent to moral drama. They ask a colder question: how many steps exist between intention and execution? That number matters more than people want to admit, because every extra step is an opportunity for interruption, a moment where attention can leak, where emotional state can shift, where competing impulses can intervene. The action itself may be simple, but access to the action is not. This is where countless routines quietly fail. Not in the middle, before contact, before movement, before the behavior ever has a chance to demonstrate difficulty. This reveals something unsettling. A person can sincerely desire change and still repeatedly fail, not because the desire is weak, but because the environment taxes initiation with surgical efficiency. The architecture wins before intention can even enter the room. This changes how behavior should be designed. Instead of asking how to become more motivated, a more useful question emerges: how can the environment become less resistant? This is a different philosophy entirely. It treats consistency less like an emotional achievement and more like an engineering problem. Move the book closer. Prepare the workspace beforehand. Remove decisions. Reduce setup. Make the desired action easier to access than its alternatives. This sounds almost disappointingly mechanical, which is why it is often neglected. People are drawn to psychologically flattering solutions, mindset shifts, identity reinvention, emotional breakthroughs. These feel profound, but profound does not always outperform practical. A lowered barrier can outperform a passionate intention with humiliating consistency, because convenience compounds. A slightly easier action repeated daily creates an enormous behavioral advantage over time, not through inspiration, through reduced resistance. This principle is deeply subversive. It implies that many failures attributed to character are partially environmental artifacts. not imaginary, not excuses, real frictions with real behavioral consequences. This does not remove responsibility. It relocates responsibility away from self-condemnation toward structural design. The individual is no longer asking, "Why am I not stronger?" but something far more useful. What is making action unnecessarily difficult? But reducing friction reveals a deeper discomfort. Many people are more attached to the fantasy of difficult change than to change itself. Difficulty feels noble. It flatters the ego. It creates a dramatic personal mythology. If progress is hard, then suffering can be interpreted as evidence of seriousness. This creates a subtle addiction, not to results, to struggle. So when a path becomes simpler, cleaner, less resistant, some people distrust it. It feels illegitimate, too easy to count, too small to respect, too practical to feel transformational. And so they unconsciously reintroduce complexity, more rules, more preparation, more layers between desire and execution, as if friction itself were proof of value. This is one of the most elegant forms of self-sabotage. Not refusing progress, decorating it with unnecessary resistance until it becomes behaviorally unsustainable. The person remains loyal to the aesthetic of effort while quietly abandoning the reality of repetition. This is rarely conscious, which is what makes it dangerous. The environment is modified not to support action, but to preserve a self-image built around difficulty. And once identity becomes invested in struggle, ease can begin to feel psychologically threatening. Because if change was never meant to be this hard, then an even more uncomfortable question begins to emerge. How much of your inconsistency was never caused by incapacity, but by your loyalty to systems that made progress harder than it needed to be? If progress were built from moments of intensity, history would belong to the most emotionally explosive people. It does not. Human transformation is often far less dramatic, quieter, less cinematic, less dependent on rare peaks of inspiration than people want to believe. Few historical figures illustrate this more clearly than Benjamin Franklin. Long before productivity systems were packaged into modern language, Franklin constructed something surprisingly methodical, a personal system of behavioral tracking, not to perform perfection, not to create the image of moral superiority, but to observe repetition. In his autobiography, Franklin described a system organized around 13 virtues: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. Each virtue was assigned focused attention in rotating cycles. He carried a small notebook, a grid, rows and columns, days of the week, virtues listed systematically, failures marked visibly. The purpose was not the elimination of imperfection. This distinction matters. Franklin openly acknowledged that complete mastery was unrealistic. He did not expect flawless execution. He expected recurrence, return, observation, correction, again and again. This is psychologically important, because the notebook transformed identity from abstraction into evidence. Instead of asking, "Am I a disciplined person?" Franklin built a mechanism that replaced identity speculation with repeated behavioral data. Marks on a page, visible patterns, documented recurrence. Identity stopped depending on emotional self-description. It became something behaviorally traceable. This is radically less flattering than most people prefer. The ego enjoys grand declarations. The system does not care. It records. A person can believe almost anything about themselves in the absence of evidence. Repetition is what interrupts fantasy. This system contains a deeply uncomfortable implication. Identity is not primarily built through emotional conviction, not through self-concept, not through the intensity with which a person imagines their future self. Identity is shaped through repeated contact between behavior and time. Pattern, observed long enough to become believable. Franklin's method was not glamorous. No grand transformation ritual.
No sudden awakening.
just daily confrontation with behavioral residue, a mark where a lapse occurred, a blank where repetition succeeded. This simplicity is psychologically brutal because it removes ambiguity. Without tracking, self-perception remains flexible. A person can reinterpret inconsistency endlessly. Excuses remain available. Memory can be edited. Narratives can be softened. But visible repetition hardens reality. Pattern emerges whether flattering or not. And patterns are difficult to argue with. This is why tracking systems can feel strangely threatening. Not because they are restrictive, because they expose. They reveal the difference between intended identity and enacted identity, between aspiration and recurrence. This gap is often larger than people want to see. Franklin's notebook did not ask whether he cared about virtue, only whether behavior repeated. That distinction is merciless. Care is invisible. Intention is invisible. Desire is invisible. Behavior leaves residue, and residue accumulates into pattern. Over time, pattern becomes reputation. First externally, then internally. The self begins updating based on repeated evidence. Not promises, not moods, not isolated heroic moments. A person becomes increasingly believable to themselves through recurrence alone. There is another subtle power hidden in Franklin's design. It normalized imperfection without normalizing disengagement. This is a rare psychological balance. Many people collapse after visible failure because they interpret deviation as identity contradiction. A missed day becomes evidence. A lapse becomes a verdict. But Franklin's tracking system assumed imperfection structurally. Errors were expected, not catastrophic, not identity-destroying, recorded, observed, integrated. This changes the emotional consequences of failure. A mistake is no longer a dramatic moral event. It becomes data, one mark in a larger sequence. This is behaviorally stabilizing, because perfectionism depends on exaggerating the meaning of local errors. A single deviation is inflated into symbolic collapse. But within a tracking system, errors are contextualized, contained, placed inside a broader behavioral pattern. This weakens the psychological violence of all-or-nothing thinking, not by eliminating standards, by embedding failure inside continuity. The system remains intact even when behavior is imperfect. This is crucial, because sustainable identity is not built from the absence of error. It is built from continued participation despite error. Franklin did not need spotless pages. He needed pages that continued being filled. That distinction is everything. A blank notebook says nothing. An imperfect notebook says someone returned. This is where repetition becomes more than habit. It becomes identity construction, not through dramatic emotional revelation, through accumulated proof. Small evidence repeated until disbelief becomes harder to maintain. A person who repeatedly returns begins inheriting a new internal reputation. Not because they declared change, because they documented it. This is psychologically transformative in a way intensity rarely is. Intensity is seductive but unstable, creates temporary certainty. Repetition creates durable credibility, and credibility changes behavior. The individual begins acting differently not because they feel different, but because self-trust has been incrementally earned. This is slower, less exciting, more difficult to romanticize, but far more robust. Franklin's notebook was primitive technology serving a sophisticated psychological function. It externalized self-construction. Identity was no longer a story told internally. It became a visible archive. Evidence accumulated line by line, day by day, not proving greatness, something more useful, proof of return. And return is where identity quietly hardens. Not in dramatic reinvention, in repeated contact with chosen behavior across ordinary time. But beneath this method lies something even more unsettling. Because once behavior is repeated long enough to begin shaping identity, another force begins resisting change from a completely different direction. Not from effort, not from friction, but from the strange human instinct to remain loyal to the version of yourself you already know. There is a dangerous fantasy hidden inside most ideas about progress. That transformation arrives through dramatic reinvention, a radical decision, a new beginning powerful enough to erase previous patterns. This fantasy is emotionally intoxicating, feels clean, heroic, final, and it repeatedly fails, because real life does not cooperate with cinematic momentum. Energy fluctuates, motivation degrades, attention fractures, unexpected problems intrude, bad days arrive without permission. Any system dependent on sustained intensity is structurally fragile. It may work briefly, then reality begins applying pressure. This is the environment Dave Brailsford inherited when he became performance director of British Cycling in 2003. At the time, British cycling had little historical prestige in elite track cycling. For nearly a century, the team had produced underwhelming international results. Olympic dominance was not the expectation. It was almost unimaginable. Brailsford did not respond with a revolutionary grand gesture.
No singular dramatic intervention.
Instead, he introduced a philosophy that would later become widely known as the aggregation of marginal gains. The principle was deceptively simple. Improve everything by 1%. Not one thing dramatically, many things minimally. Bike seats adjusted for comfort. Tires tested for optimal grip. Cyclists taught improved hand-washing routines to reduce illness risk. Massage gels tested for recovery quality. Pillows and mattresses selected to improve sleep during travel. Even seemingly absurd details were examined. Nothing was considered too small. This was not obsession with perfection. It was a rejection of heroic thinking. Progress was decomposed into survivable increments. Small enough to repeat, small enough to maintain, small enough to remain operational when ideal conditions disappeared. This philosophy contains a profound behavioral advantage. It assumes imperfection in advance. A system built around tiny gains does not collapse when maximum performance is unavailable, because maximum performance was never the operating requirement. This is psychologically stabilizing. Many people unintentionally design routines that only function under ideal circumstances. High energy, clear schedule, strong mood, minimal stress, perfect focus. These conditions are temporary privileges, not durable infrastructure. Once they disappear, the routine becomes behaviorally inaccessible. Collapse follows. Brailsford's system functioned differently. His power came from distributed improvement. No single adjustment needed to carry the entire burden of progress. This matters enormously, because systems fail when they become too dependent on singular high-effort events. One perfect workout, one ultra-productive day, one massive breakthrough. These are emotionally rewarding, but structurally fragile. Marginal gains shift the logic. Instead of requiring dramatic victories, the system asks a quieter question. What can still improve under current conditions? Not ideal conditions, current ones. This is the difference between performance mythology and adaptive continuity. A bad day no longer invalidates the system. It simply changes the available margin. Maybe output decreases. Fine. Adjustment remains possible. A smaller gain is still a gain. This sounds underwhelming to the ego, which is exactly why it is powerful. The ego wants dramatic proof. Reality rewards survivability. A system capable of functioning under degraded conditions is often more powerful than a system optimized for brilliance. Because brilliance is episodic. Continuity compounds. The results became historically visible. At the 2008 Beijing Olympics, British cyclists won 60% of available gold medals in track cycling. A staggering reversal. At the 2012 London Olympics, they repeated extraordinary dominance. The philosophy extended further. Team Sky, also under Brailsford's leadership principles, went on to win the Tour de France multiple times. Observers often searched for a hidden secret, a superior training hack, a breakthrough innovation, something dramatic enough to explain extraordinary outcomes. But the explanation was psychologically less satisfying. No single factor carried the transformation. That was the point. The accumulation mattered more than the individual components. This is difficult for the human mind to emotionally respect. People are biased toward visible breakthroughs, singular causes, clean stories. They want transformation to be attributable to one decisive move. But systems built on marginal gains reject narrative simplicity. Progress becomes granular, distributed, almost invisible in the short term, which makes it psychologically hard to trust. Because small improvements rarely generate emotional excitement. They often feel insultingly insufficient, too minor to matter, too modest to count. Yet this is precisely how continuity survives. By lowering the demand placed on each individual action. No single day is forced to justify the entire mission. No moment carries impossible symbolic weight. The burden is distributed across repetition, across accumulation, across time. This changes the emotional meaning of bad days. A bad day becomes less threatening inside a system where no single day was ever assigned total importance. This is the deeper lesson hidden beneath marginal gains. Survival is often more predictive than intensity. Not because intensity is useless, because intensity is unreliable. It arrives in waves, flatters identity, then disappears. Systems built around intensity create a dangerous emotional dependency. The individual feels powerful only while performing at high output. Anything less feels like regression, failure, loss of self. This is psychologically catastrophic, because ordinary human variability becomes interpreted as evidence of collapse. Brailsford's model quietly rejects this trap. Progress is allowed to remain alive under suboptimal conditions. Reduced output does not equal system death, only adaptation. This is far less glamorous than total reinvention, but dramatically more durable. A reduced version still protects continuity, still preserves movement, still accumulates. This is what many people resist emotionally. They would rather perform perfectly for 3 days than imperfectly for 300. Because perfection satisfies identity faster. Continuity asks for something harder. Tolerance for incompleteness. Tolerance for gradualism. Tolerance for invisible accumulation. And this tolerance is psychologically rare. It demands surrendering the fantasy of dramatic transformation in exchange for something less emotionally exciting but far more dangerous to the old self. Predictability. Because once your life is no longer built on intensity, a more destabilizing realization begins to emerge. You can no longer blame inconsistency on bad days. And when that excuse disappears, what remains underneath can be much harder to confront. There is a final illusion that quietly poisons human effort. The belief that quality must come first. That excellence is the prerequisite for repetition. That something should only be done once conditions are favorable enough to justify doing it well. This belief appears sophisticated, discerning, standards-driven. It is often disguised perfectionism, and it creates paralysis, because if quality becomes the admission price for action, action becomes increasingly rare. A very different lesson emerged from a famous classroom experiment often attributed to photographer Jerry Uelsman while teaching at the University of Florida. At the beginning of the semester, photography students were divided into 2 groups. One group would be graded purely on quantity. The more photos they produced, the better their grade. 100 photos for an A, fewer for lower marks. The second group would be graded purely on quality. They needed to submit only 1 photograph, but it had to be exceptional. The arrangement seemed intuitively obvious. The quality group appeared advantaged. More time, more reflection, more refinement, more opportunity to pursue excellence. And yet, by the end of the term, a striking pattern emerged. The highest quality photographs largely came from the quantity group, not the quality group. The students producing more work, more attempts, more repetitions, more experiments, ended up creating superior final results, while the quality-focused students often became trapped, thinking, planning, analyzing, trying to conceptualize perfection before accumulating enough repetitions to discover it. This is psychologically devastating to the perfectionistic mind, because it inverts a cherished assumption. Quality was not the prerequisite for repetition. Repetition was the mechanism through which quality emerged. This finding reveals something deeply uncomfortable. Skill is often built through tolerated imperfection, not avoided imperfection. People who obsess over producing something excellent immediately are often protecting themselves from necessary contact with mediocrity. Early bad attempts, awkward repetitions, embarrassing versions, visible incompetence. These are not unfortunate detours. They are structural ingredients. The quantity group was forced into repeated contact with imperfection. Again and again, each photograph provided feedback, a new mistake, a new adjustment, a new microcorrection. No single output carried excessive symbolic weight. This is behaviorally liberating. When any one attempt matters too much, experimentation becomes emotionally dangerous. Risk increases, novelty decreases, action slows. But when output is distributed across many repetitions, psychological pressure is diluted. Failure becomes less catastrophic. One mediocre result means almost nothing. There will be another attempt, and another. This changes the emotional climate of learning. The individual becomes less fragile, less threatened by error, more behaviorally resilient. This is the hidden power of quantity, not mindless production. Repeated exposure to imperfection without identity collapse. A system where mistakes are metabolized instead of dramatized. This matters beyond photography, because most people do not fail due to lack of potential. They fail because their relationship to imperfect output is too psychologically unstable. They cannot survive enough mediocre repetitions to become good. This is where consistency becomes something stronger than discipline. It becomes anti-fragility. A fragile system is damaged by variation. A more robust system tolerates variation. But an anti-fragile system improves because of variation. Repeated imperfect output creates precisely this effect. Each attempt contains information, a mismatch between intention and execution, a flaw revealed, a weakness made visible. The perfectionistic mind treats this as threat, evidence of inadequacy, something to avoid. But repetition changes the meaning of error. Error becomes usable material, not verdict, not humiliation, data. This is why the quantity group improved, not despite producing more imperfect work. Because of it, their system allowed mistakes to accumulate as information instead of identity injury. This is a radically different psychological operating system. The person no longer needs each action to confirm competence. Action becomes an extraction process. Something is learned, adjusted, reattempted. The system feeds on output, good or bad. This makes consistency far more durable, because durability no longer depends on emotional protection from failure. Failure has been integrated, neutralized, converted into usable signal. This is extraordinarily powerful. A person who can repeatedly act without being psychologically shattered by imperfect results becomes increasingly difficult to stop. Not because they are fearless, because the system no longer breaks under ordinary reality. This is the deeper inversion hidden beneath all durable progress. Consistency is not merely repetition. It is repeated exposure to reality without collapse. To bad outputs, low energy days, unimpressive attempts, suboptimal conditions, visible imperfection, and still returning, again, and again, and again. This is what gradually destroys the tyranny of all-or-nothing thinking. Not through intellectual understanding, through behavioral evidence. The nervous system begins learning a new rule. Nothing catastrophic happened. An imperfect day occurred. Action still happened. Continuity survived. This lesson sounds small. It is not. It is identity-altering, because a person who learns they can remain in motion under imperfect conditions becomes dangerous to old patterns. The mind can no longer convincingly argue that less than ideal equals failure. A reduced version has already proven otherwise. Something was still built, still protected, still advanced. The mythology of perfection begins starving from lack of reinforcement. And underneath it, something quieter takes shape. a less glamorous identity, far more powerful. Someone who no longer needs the day to be special in order to continue. Someone whose behavior has become harder to interrupt than their emotions are to destabilize. That is where real consistency begins. Not when life becomes easier, but when your system finally stops negotiating with reality. Most people spend years negotiating with themselves. Quiet negotiations, invisible ones, promises made in private. Tomorrow I will start properly. On Monday I will become serious. When life becomes calmer, cleaner, less chaotic, then everything will finally align. This negotiation never ends because its terms are fraudulent. The future is being asked to provide conditions reality was never designed to offer. Perfect emotional weather, perfect clarity, perfect readiness, a life without interruption. It does not exist. And somewhere deep down, most people know this, which is why procrastination often contains something darker than laziness. It contains strategic delay. Delay as emotional protection. Because as long as action is postponed, identity remains theoretically intact. Potential stays untested. Fantasy survives. The imagined version of the self remains undamaged by contact with reality. This is seductive, painfully seductive. An unfinished possibility can feel safer than an imperfect reality. A blank page contains no evidence.
No limits. No contradiction.
Only projection. But blankness is not neutral. It extracts a cost. Silently, days become months. Months become years. A person can spend extraordinary amounts of life protecting an identity they never actually inhabit. Not because they lacked intelligence, or ambition, or desire, but because they preferred preserving imagined excellence over tolerating visible imperfection. This is the hidden tax of perfectionism. It does not merely slow action. It converts life into deferred participation. There is another consequence few people confront honestly. Inconsistency does not only damage external progress. It erodes self-trust. Quietly, repeatedly, a person makes an internal commitment, then breaks it, again, then again. The damage is subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but over time something changes. The mind begins updating expectations, not based on aspiration, based on evidence. Promises lose credibility. Intentions feel decorative. Language itself becomes contaminated. Words like "I will" begin carrying less psychological force. This is not dramatic. It is corrosive, because self-trust is not a philosophical concept. It is a predictive model, a relationship between declared intention and observed behavior. And once this relationship degrades, motivation becomes increasingly difficult to access. Not because desire vanished, because belief did. The person stops fully believing their own commitments. This creates a brutal loop. Low trust reduces action. Reduced action produces more evidence of unreliability. Unreliability further lowers trust. The cycle reinforces itself. From the outside, it looks like lack of discipline. Internally, it is often a credibility crisis. This is why rebuilding consistency feels emotionally disproportionate. You are not merely doing a task. You are renegotiating your relationship with your own word, trying to make your internal promises believable again. Not through emotion, not through declarations, through evidence, tiny evidence, repeated long enough to alter prediction. Because eventually the most important observer of your behavior is not the world. It is the part of you quietly learning whether your words mean anything at all. Many people believe freedom means living without structure.
No constraints. No routines.
No systems. Only spontaneity. Only emotional authenticity. Only acting when desire naturally appears. This interpretation feels liberating, until examined closely, because a life governed entirely by fluctuating emotion is not freedom. It is dependency. Dependency on internal weather. Dependency on energy, mood, impulse, circumstance. A person like this appears free only on good days, when conditions cooperate. But remove favorable conditions and the illusion collapses. Nothing stabilizes behavior. Nothing protects continuity. Life becomes reactive, fragmented, governed by whatever psychological state happens to dominate the moment. This is not autonomy. It is exposure. Real freedom is more paradoxical. It often looks less emotionally romantic, more repetitive, more structured, sometimes even boring, because structure reduces negotiation. It lowers decision fatigue, removes friction, protects behavior from emotional volatility. A system is not a prison unless it is externally imposed and internally resisted. A chosen system can function as behavioral shelter, a container protecting action from psychological chaos. This is what many people misunderstand. They fear routine because they confuse repetition with limitation. But repetition can be a form of liberation, not from effort, from internal instability. The person who no longer requires emotional alignment to act has quietly acquired a form of freedom unavailable to those still waiting to feel ready. In the end, the deepest conflict was never between discipline and laziness, not between ambition and comfort, not even between action and avoidance. It was between fantasy and reality. Fantasy says life begins once conditions become worthy of your best self. Reality does not negotiate. Reality begins immediately, under fatigue, under distraction, under emotional noise, under imperfect circumstances no one would voluntarily choose. And this is where most lives quietly diverge. Not through dramatic decisions, through daily response to ordinary imperfection. One person waits for alignment, another acts inside misalignment. One protects self-image, another tolerates friction. One preserves theoretical potential, another slowly converts existence into evidence. The gap compounds, not because one person possessed superior genetics, intelligence, or motivation, but because one accepted a condition the other continued resisting. That life will almost never present itself in finished form. It arrives fragmented, messy, interruptive, incomplete, and asks a brutally simple question. Will you participate anyway? Most people spend their lives trying to deserve action. But action was never a reward for becoming ideal. It was always the price of becoming real.